Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating and honestly eerie historical mysteries of the late Bronze Age, the sudden disappearance of the Hittite Empire. We're going to investigate how one of the great superpowers of the ancient Near East, an empire that wasn't just some minor forgotten tribe, but a massive geopolitical heavyweight, managed to rise to incredible heights and then just seemingly vanish from history. If you love unraveling historical puzzles by looking at the hard evidence, you are absolutely in the right place. Let's get into it.
Okay, picture this stark contrast. It's around 1200 BCE in ancient Anatolia. First, imagine the booming capital of Hattusa. We're talking enormous stone walls towering over the landscape, dusty roads packed with heavy chariots, and a city absolutely bustling with soldiers, scribes, merchants, and craftsmen. It's the beating heart of a thriving empire. But then, the atmosphere abruptly shifts to this silent aftermath. Abandoned streets, completely empty storage rooms, shattered pottery everywhere, a totally silent palace, and just the faint trace of smoke rising in the distance.
Seeing that kind of total devastation brings us right to the central question driving our investigation today. How on earth could one of the most powerful kingdoms of the ancient world collapse so completely that its empire practically disappeared from history? I mean, at their absolute peak, the Hittites controlled a massive chunk of Anatolia and had huge influence over northern Syria. They were literally powerful enough to go toe-to-toe with Egypt. So how does a superpower capable of rivaling the pharaohs simply go silent?
Well, to understand their mysterious fall, we first have to understand their incredible rise, which was entirely rooted in their geography. Ancient Anatolia, which is in modern-day Turkey, was a total strategic powerhouse, and the Hittites, they played this challenging landscape perfectly. They used the rugged mountains as natural defenses, while the high plateaus, valleys, and forests gave them abundant resources and vital agricultural land. But the real kicker? Controlling Anatolia meant they connected different parts of the ancient Near East, giving them a chokehold on crucial trade routes. This landscape was the literal foundation of their sophisticated imperial state.
Now, despite them living so long ago, we aren't just guessing about how they ran their empire. The Hittites spoke an Indo-European language, and they recorded it using cuneiform. These highly trained scribes would press wedge-shaped signs right into wet clay tablets. And thankfully for us, they left behind thousands of these tablets, which survived the centuries to give us an unbelievably detailed look into their ancient world. Because of this obsessive record-keeping, historians today have the receipts, detailed accounts of their diplomacy, their laws, religious rituals, and just everyday administration.
Armed with those records, we can see exactly how they built their dominion. And let me tell you, it wasn't just mindless brute force. During the second millennium BCE, leaders like the incredibly powerful King Superlulioma I were absolute master strategists. Sure, they used strategic military force, but that was just step one. They cleverly arranged diplomatic marriages, forged deep political alliances, and set up loyal vassal states. They didn't just conquer everything in sight, they built a really complex, interconnected web of political dominance.
Of course, all that smooth diplomacy required a pretty serious stick to back up the carrot. And that brings us to the famous Hittite war machine. Now, I want to be super clear here based on our sources. They didn't have any magical, impossible technology. Nope. Their strength came from sheer military experience, incredible organization, and just flawless logistics. They fielded highly trained infantry backed by massive, formidable chariots, all secured by a network of fortified cities. Just imagine the sheer psychological terror of this huge, well-drilled imperial army rolling relentlessly through the ancient Near East.
Which brings us to Section 1, Clash of the Titans, the Hittites versus New Kingdom Egypt.
So you can't be a superpower in the ancient Near East without eventually bumping heads with the other massive kid on the block, right? This epic rivalry culminated in the 13th century BCE at the legendary Battle of Kadesh. On one side, you've got the Hittite Empire led by King Muwatalli II. On the other, New Kingdom Egypt, led by the famous pharaoh Ramesses II. This was an absolute clash of titans. Both armies converged on the battlefield, relying heavily on these fierce, massive chariot-based military strategies. It was a terrifying, chaotic, and incredibly bloody confrontation that pushed both of these superpowers to their absolute breaking points.
But you know what's absolutely fascinating about the Battle of Kadesh? The aftermath. Because there was no clear winner here. Both Egypt and the Hittite Empire aggressively spun the conflict in their own historical records as a massive, glorious victory for themselves. It is literally an ancient textbook example of political propaganda. Neither side truly broke the other, and the battle definitely didn't result in a clear Egyptian conquest of the Hittites.
Realizing that endlessly fighting each other was just draining both their empires,
they eventually did something pretty remarkable. Years later, Hittite king Hattusili III and Ramesses II signed what is widely considered one of the world's first great peace treaties. And the terms are incredible for the ancient world. It ended years of bitter conflict with a mutual commitment to peace and non-aggression. They even pledged mutual military assistance if either got attacked by a third party, and agreed to return political fugitives to one another. What's so cool is that versions of this extraordinary international diplomacy survive in both Egyptian and Hittite contexts to this very day.
Moving on to Section 2, Beyond the Battlefield, a complex society.
It's so easy to get caught up in the kings and the chariots, but the true backbone of this superpower wasn't just its soldiers. It was ordinary people living really complex lives. This empire was sustained by a vibrant, multi-layered economy. You had farmers working the fields and tending livestock, traveling merchants driving these expansive trade networks between cities, incredibly skilled metalworkers and craftsmen, priests performing vital rituals, and of course those busy scribes managing all the taxation and administration. All of these people worked tirelessly together to keep the great imperial engine running.
And the everyday lives of all those people were deeply intertwined with a remarkably diverse religion. The Hittites worshipped what they famously called 1,000 gods. Now, that phrase wasn't a literal fixed number. It was more of a broad expression showing how they acted almost like a cultural sponge. They adopted and incorporated gods from different peoples all across Anatolia and the neighboring regions, like local Anatolian deities and adopted Syrian traditions. While major deities like the storm god and the sun goddess of Arena held the most prominent roles, their pantheon was vast. Rituals, festivals, weather, fertility, kingship, and divine protection were all deeply connected in this incredibly inclusive belief system.
Let's jump to Section 3, Hattusa, the heart of the empire.
All of this society, religion, and military might flowed directly into one spectacular central location. When you walked up to Hattusa, you were supposed to feel small. The architecture itself was literally a tool of imperial dominance. Visitors were greeted by the monumental Lion Gate and the seriously impressive Sphinx Gate. Inside, the sprawling Great Temple stood as this massive testament to their wealth and devotion, and the whole thing was surrounded by huge, seemingly impenetrable defensive stone walls. Every single stone placed in Hattusa loudly broadcasted the power of the empire to anyone who dared enter.
Yet, this brings us right back to the unsettling mystery we introduced at the very beginning of this explainer. On one hand, we have a civilization that demonstrated incredible generational survival. I mean, the Hittites survived brutal wars, rival empires like Egypt, and intense internal political conspiracies. But then, on the other hand, we face the fall. By the end of the imperial period, archaeologists found clear, chilling evidence of destruction and abandonment. This once powerful, heavily fortified capital eventually just became largely deserted.
This brings us to Section 4, the first warning signs, the Late Bronze Age collapse.
To actually understand how Hattusa fell, we have to look past their own city walls at a massive, interconnected crisis that was spreading across the ancient Near East. There was this mounting instability, a gathering storm that doomed the whole era, and it wasn't just one single event. Starting in the late 13th century BCE, the vital Eastern Mediterranean trade networks began to break down. Then, by the early 12th century BCE, there was severe political upheaval combined with widespread violent attacks. By the mid-12th century, we see evidence of mass migrations and significant, possible environmental stress. Basically, multiple civilizations across the entire Eastern Mediterranean and Near East were suddenly thrown into a total crisis, all at the same time. Actually, before we go any further, it's highly important we bust a major historical myth right here. The population did not simply vanish into thin air. Historians stress this point. While the central Hittite imperial state and its government completely collapsed, the people themselves and their cultural traditions actually survived. They just continued on in different, smaller regions. The superpower was gone, sure, but the human beings remained. So as we picture the once mighty streets of Hattusa falling completely quiet, the palace dark, the temple silent, and the great trade roads empty, I want to leave you with this provocative thought to set up part 2 of our explainer. The Hittites survived so much for so long, but when the entire ancient world changed, their empire was erased from historical memory for centuries. What exactly happened next? Was it drought, famine, unceasing war, massive migration, a total economic collapse, internal instability, or just a fatal combination of all these forces that finally brought one of the ancient world's greatest powers to its knees? We'll follow the evidence into their final days next time.
Picture this. It's 3,000 years ago, and you're looking at one of the absolute undisputed heavyweights of the ancient world. Welcome to This Explainer, where we are diving headfirst into a fascinating historical cold case to figure out exactly how the mighty Hittite Empire collapsed. Because these guys, they were a true superpower. They were negotiating international treaties, commanding massive armies, and running an incredibly sophisticated bureaucracy. And then, within a relatively short window of time, the entire imperial machine just came crashing down. So, how does a superpower just vanish? Well, that is exactly what we're going to unpack today.
Let's step right into our primary crime scene. We're heading to the capital city of Hattusa. Now, I want you to imagine a sprawling, monumental city that literally rivaled Egypt in its grandeur. We're talking massive stone walls, towering royal buildings, and storehouses just bustling with activity. Okay, now take all of that and picture it completely silent. Empty streets, abandoned temples lying under a dark sky. The physical evidence tells us that Hattusa was just eventually abandoned as the center of the Hittite world. The political system that made this city the heartbeat of a massive territory, it simply ceased to exist.
So, looking at those quiet ruins, we really have to ask ourselves a crucial question, mostly to bust a pretty major historical myth. For the longest time, it was super tempting to think this complex civilization just vanished overnight because one big, overwhelming army marched in and burned the whole thing to the ground. But as we actually dig into the evidence, the archaeological reality points to a much more complex process of transformation and abandonment. We aren't hunting for a single murderer here. We are looking at a total system-wide failure. Section: A wider regional crisis. To truly solve a mystery like this, we have to zoom way out from Hattusa and look at the broader geographical picture of the Eastern Mediterranean.
The absolutely crucial thing to understand is that the Hittite downfall wasn't some isolated freak event. It was actually part of a massive region-wide domino effect known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. Right around the end of the 13th and the dawn of the 12th centuries BCE, major states and cities all across Anatolia, the Levant, Cyprus, and the wider Mediterranean basically imploded. We're talking severe political upheaval, destruction, and total abandonment happening within just a few decades of each other. Now, historians still debate exactly how deeply connected all these events were, but there is no doubt the Hittites were caught in a much, much larger storm.
Section: Interconnected Pressures. Let's actually investigate the different suspects and the overlapping pressures that were tearing at the fabric of the Hittite state all at once.
Think of this like a terrifying chain reaction. Paleoclimate research shows us that right around the end of the Bronze Age, this region got hit with severe drought and reduced precipitation. Well, less rain directly translates to shrinking agricultural harvests. When harvests shrink, the food shortages begin. And those shortages put an immense amount of stress on the population, which in turn severely weakens the government's central authority. Suddenly, the state is ripe for internal succession struggles. And what happens when you have a politically divided, starving empire? You get highly vulnerable borders that practically invite warfare.
When you map all of these interacting pressures out simultaneously, a pretty terrifying picture emerges. It wasn't one bad day. You have environmental stress totally tanking food production. At the exact same time, you've got internal conflicts, rival factions, and royal succession disputes just eating away at the empire's ability to govern. Add to that snapping trade routes, cutting off vital resources, and top the whole thing off with sustained warfare and rebellions on the borders. None of these factors operating by themselves explains the collapse, but together, it's the ultimate perfect storm.
You know, an empire might be able to rally and survive a foreign army, but when the ground itself stops producing food, that's when the real panic sets in. We actually have their surviving administrative letters, literally clay tablets begging for grain shipments, and they reveal these incredibly acute royal anxieties. We are talking about desperate, frantic international diplomacy just to secure basic food supplies. It perfectly highlights how a state that is completely dependent on reliable harvests becomes terrifyingly fragile during a prolonged climate shift. And food wasn't the only thing they needed moving across their borders. Just like our globalized world today, these Bronze Age states relied heavily on long-distance trade. They desperately needed copper and tin, literally the foundational ingredients for bronze, plus precious metals, timber, and grain. Because the Hittite Empire was so deeply woven into these economic networks, any disruption in a neighboring, unstable kingdom would instantly shatter their supply chains. When the wider Late Bronze Age world destabilized, the Hittite economy took a massive, fatal hit. Now, I really want to clear up a major misconception right here. There is this very popular myth floating around that the Hittites were definitively wiped off the map by a single, mysterious, invading army known as the Sea Peoples.
but the archaeological reality is vastly different. While Egyptian records definitely mention these groups, their exact identities, their movements, and their actual role in the collapse are still heavily debated. The truth is, the Hittites were facing enemies, border pressures, and rebellions from multiple directions across a massive territory. It was not just one definitive phantom army.
Section: Survival of the Hittites. This brings us to a major twist in our historical cold case regarding what actually went down after Hattusa was abandoned. This part is incredibly important. The collapse of the Hittite Empire did not mean the sudden, magical disappearance of every single Hittite person. The imperial state died, yes. The central authority vanished, the politics fragmented, and Hattusa fell silent. But the actual people, they survived. Over the next few centuries, smaller successor states, known as Neo-Hittite and Syro-Hittite kingdoms, thrived down in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria. They carved out new political identities, all while keeping those rich Hittite cultural traditions totally alive.
Section: Rediscovery and Legacy. So, how on earth was this magnificent culture completely lost to memory only to be dramatically pulled back into the light thousands of years later? It's honestly one of the strangest twists in history. Think about it. Unlike Rome or Greece or Egypt, whose legacies were remembered continuously throughout time, the Hittites basically vanished entirely from global memory. For centuries, the wider world totally forgot they ever existed. It wasn't until the modern era that archaeologists started unearthing their massive monumental architecture, those enormous stone gates and the grand temples, literally pulling an entire lost civilization right out of the earth. And the absolute best part for historians wasn't just finding the buildings, it was realizing that this civilization had actually left behind a massive, incredibly detailed written voice. Excavations at Hattusa uncovered an enormous archive, over 30,000 clay tablets. By cracking these cuneiform signs, scholars unlocked the forgotten Hittite language, which fundamentally rewrote our entire understanding of the ancient Near East. When you read translations of these tablets, you aren't just reading dry, dusty history. You are feeling the daily pulse of a highly connected society, fighting for its survival. They recorded everything. We can read about their mighty kings and their bitter, petty succession disputes. We can see the international treaties they hammered out and the desperate hunger they faced as the climate turned on them. We learn about their religion, and maybe most importantly, we hear the faint echoes of ordinary people just trying to survive through truly chaotic times. There's a really powerful takeaway from our sources that I think perfectly summarizes the ultimate danger of total systems failure. It's the idea that the real lesson of the Hittites isn't just how a civilization vanished, but how even the most powerful empire on Earth becomes incredibly vulnerable when political power, food supplies, trade, climate, and warfare all begin to fail at the exact same time. It wasn't one lost battle. It was the crushing weight of everything falling apart at once. And I really want to leave you with this thought as we wrap up this explainer. We live in an ultra-connected world today. We rely entirely on complex global supply chains, really fragile political diplomacy, and a shifting climate. If a civilization as grand and advanced as the Hittites could completely fragment when all of its systems failed simultaneously, it really makes you wonder about our own modern vulnerabilities, doesn't it? Keep questioning history, my friends, because the past is always speaking right to the present. Thanks for hanging out with me on this deep dive into the Hittite cold case.